When Officer Victor Marlowe collapsed to his knees on the cold tile floor of Fairview's community center, tears streaming down his weathered face, the entire room fell silent. But it wasn't the sight of an armed gunman that broke this 20-year veteran. It was the realization that the man bleeding from a bullet wound, a bullet meant for him, was the same quiet single father he'd publicly humiliated years before. Blood pooled beneath Caleb Wainwright's shoulder as paramedics rushed to his side. His 8-year-old daughter, Liana, pressed her small hands against the glass doors, watching her father's sacrifice unfold. And Officer Marlowe? He couldn't stop shaking. You see, we've all misjudged someone. We've all let pride blind us to the truth about another person's character. But most of us never have to watch that person take a bullet meant for us. 3 hours earlier, this community gathering was supposed to celebrate unity. Families shared stories, children played games, and the autumn air carried the promise of peaceful times ahead. Officer Marlowe patrolled the perimeter with his usual authority, his badge gleaming under the warm lights. He was the protector, the one in charge. Caleb Wainwright arrived quietly, as he always did. Work boots scuffed from his morning shift at the hardware store, calloused hands gently guiding his daughter through the crowd. To most people, he was just another face, unremarkable, forgettable. The kind of man who blends into the background while others take center stage. But backgrounds can be deceiving. When Marcus Dunbar burst through those doors, desperation burning in his eyes and a gun trembling in his grip, everything changed. The festive atmosphere shattered like glass. Parents grabbed their children. Elderly couples ducked behind tables, and Officer Marlowe found himself staring down the barrel of a weapon, his training kicking in, but his body frozen for just one crucial second. That's when Caleb moved. Not the trained officer, not the armed professional. The quiet single father who'd been dismissed, overlooked, and yes, humiliated by the very man he was about to save. In that split second, as the gunman's finger tightened on the trigger, Caleb Wainwright made a choice that would expose the true measure of both men's hearts. He lunged forward, placing his body between the bullet and the officer who'd wronged him. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the community center. But it was the sight of Officer Marlowe's collapse, not from injury, but from the crushing weight of recognition that nobody would ever forget. What could make a hardened cop break down like that? What kind of man takes a bullet for someone who destroyed his dignity? Have you ever had to face the true cost of your pride? Let me know in the comments, because this story is about to show you what real heroism looks like. To understand why Caleb Wainwright's sacrifice shattered Officer Marlowe's world, you need to know who Caleb really was, and more importantly, who everyone thought he was. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., Caleb's alarm clock buzzed in the small apartment he shared with his daughter, Liana. By 6 a.m., he was brewing coffee in a kitchen where every dollar mattered. Breakfast was simple: eggs, toast, and the kind of conversation that only happens between a father and his 8-year-old daughter when the world still feels manageable. "Dad, why do you have to work 2 jobs?" Liana asked one morning, her school backpack already packed and waiting by the door. "Because taking care of you is the most important job I'll ever have," Caleb replied, adjusting her hair ribbon with the same gentle precision he used to calibrate machinery at the hardware store. Caleb's first job started at 7 a.m. at Morrison's Hardware. For 6 years, he'd been the guy customers sought out when they needed something fixed right. His hands spoke a language of competence, whether threading pipe, mixing paint, or explaining why a particular bolt would hold better than another. The store owner, Mr. Morrison, trusted him completely. Customers requested him by name, but to the outside world, he was just another employee in a faded uniform shirt. His second job began at 4 p.m., 3 hours of mechanical work at Tommy's Auto Repair. Oil changes, brake jobs, engine diagnostics. The kind of work that left grease under his fingernails and made his back ache. But it paid for Liana's school supplies, her dance lessons, and the small luxuries that made her childhood bright despite their circumstances. Between jobs, Caleb would pick up Liana from school, help with homework, and somehow make every afternoon feel like an adventure. They'd walk to the park, where he'd push her on swings while listening to stories about her day. During bedtime, he'd read her favorite books, doing different voices for each character until she giggled herself to sleep. This was Caleb's world, steady, purposeful, and largely invisible to those who wielded power in Fairview. 3 years ago, everything changed at the annual Harvest Festival. The event was meant to celebrate community spirit, but for Caleb, it became a moment of public shame that would haunt him for years. The trouble started when Liana accidentally knocked over a display of decorative pumpkins while playing with other children. The fall was minor, nobody was hurt, but the crash drew attention. As Caleb rushed to help clean up, Officer Marlowe approached with the kind of authority that demands immediate compliance. "Control your kid," Marlowe barked, his voice carrying across the crowded festival grounds. "This is a family event, not a code playground." "I'm sorry, officer," Caleb said quietly, kneeling beside Liana to comfort her. "It was an accident. We'll clean this up." But Marlowe wasn't finished. In front of dozens of neighbors, business owners, and families, he launched into a lecture about parental responsibility and respect for community property. His words cut deep, not because they were loud, but because they painted Caleb as negligent, irresponsible, and somehow less worthy of respect. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence as this uniformed authority figure dressed down a man who'd never caused trouble, never asked for help, and worked harder than most people in town. Liana pressed against her father's leg, tears streaming down her face, while Caleb absorbed the humiliation with quiet dignity. After Marlowe walked away, the festival continued. But for Caleb, something had shifted. The looks from other parents weren't quite the same. The easy conversations with neighbors became stilted. He'd been marked as someone who couldn't handle his responsibilities. Yet through it all, Caleb never spoke ill of Officer Marlowe. He never complained to friends or sought sympathy. He simply continued being the man he'd always been, working 2 jobs, raising his daughter, and contributing to his community in ways that went unnoticed. In Fairview, heroes don't wear badges. Sometimes they wear work boots and carry lunch pails, invisible to those who should see them most. Drop a heart if you know someone like Caleb, quiet heroes who go unnoticed. Officer Victor Marlowe had been carrying the weight of that festival day for 3 years. Not in his official reports or police evaluations, but in the quiet moments when his defenses came down. Some mistakes echo in the darkness of 3 a.m., when there's nowhere to hide from the truth of who we really are. Those were the hours when Marlowe would sit in his kitchen, nursing black coffee and replaying that afternoon. The way Caleb had absorbed his harsh words without fighting back. The tears in the little girl's eyes. The uncomfortable silence from the crowd. Deep down, he knew he'd crossed a line that day, but admitting it felt like admitting weakness. Victor Marlowe had joined the force 22 years ago for all the right reasons. His younger brother, Danny, had been killed in a convenience store robbery when Victor was just 25. The senseless violence had shattered his family, leaving his mother broken and his father bitter. Wearing the badge became Victor's way of preventing other families from experiencing that same devastating loss. For 2 decades, he'd built his identity around being the protector, the authority figure who kept chaos at bay. Every arrest, every stern warning, every display of power was his way of honoring Danny's memory. But somewhere along the way, protecting people had become controlling them. Authority had hardened into arrogance. The festival incident haunted him because it revealed something he didn't want to face, that his need to be right had made him cruel. Caleb Wainwright wasn't a criminal or a threat. He was just a father trying his best, exactly like Victor's own father had been, before grief changed him. Yet Victor had never apologized. Pride kept the words locked away. On that October afternoon, Victor arrived at the community center for routine patrol duty. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching under his boots as he walked the perimeter. Inside, families gathered for the monthly outreach program. The same kind of event where he'd made his mistake 3 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. Different season, same purpose, same community trying to come together. But Victor approached it with the same professional distance he'd maintained since that day. Keep order. Monitor the crowd. Stay in control. He nodded to familiar faces as he entered the main hall. Mrs. Henderson from the library, the Martinez family who ran the corner deli, Teenagers from the high school volunteering to help serve refreshments. All of them good people, living ordinary lives, just like the man he'd wronged. Victor positioned himself near the main entrance, his trained eyes scanning for potential problems. 22 years of experience had taught him to read crowds, to spot trouble before it started. The gathering felt peaceful, routine. Children played games in one corner, while adults shared coffee and conversation. The kind of scene that should have brought him comfort. He didn't notice Caleb Wainwright enter with his daughter. Caleb, for his part, had spotted the officer immediately. After 3 years, seeing Victor Marlowe still triggered a familiar knot in his stomach. But he'd come to this event for Liana, not for himself. She deserved to participate in community activities without being limited by her father's uncomfortable history. So Caleb chose a table on the opposite side of the room, helping Liana with a craft project while keeping his distance from the uniformed figure by the door. Both men went about their business, unaware of each other's presence. Victor focused on his patrol duties, while Caleb concentrated on making the afternoon special for his daughter. The weight of their shared history hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. But neither man knew that in less than an hour, everything would change forever. Marcus Mac Dunbar crashed through the community center doors like a storm breaking against calm waters. His clothes were disheveled, his face gaunt from weeks of poor decisions and desperate choices. The gun in his trembling hand caught the overhead lights, sending fragments of reflection across the walls. "Nobody move," he shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "I need money, jewelry, whatever you've got." The transformation was instant. Laughter died mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Children stopped playing, sensing danger they couldn't quite understand. The warm community gathering became a hostage situation in the space of a heartbeat. Officer Marlowe's training kicked in immediately. His hand moved toward his service weapon while his mind calculated distances, angles, and potential casualties. 22 years of experience had taught him to assess threats quickly, but this situation was different. Too many civilians, too many children, too much chaos. "Drop the weapon," Marlowe commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "There's no way out of this, son. Don't make it worse." But Mac wasn't listening. His drug-addled mind was focused on one thing: getting money to feed the addiction that had already cost him his job, his family, and his self-respect. He swung the gun wildly, pointing it at different groups of people while demanding they empty their pockets. Across the room, Caleb Wainwright's father instincts were screaming. He'd positioned himself between Liana and the gunman the moment the doors burst open, his body becoming a shield without conscious thought. But his mind was working differently than the panicked crowd around him. Caleb saw things others missed. The way Mac's hand shook indicated inexperience, not just nerves. The gun's safety was off, but the man's finger discipline was poor. Most importantly, Caleb noticed the gunman's growing frustration as people fumbled with wallets and purses, too terrified to move efficiently. "Daddy, I'm scared," Liana whispered, her small hand gripping his shirt. "Stay behind me, sweetheart," Caleb murmured, his eyes never leaving the unfolding crisis. "No matter what happens, stay behind me." The standoff might have continued for minutes, maybe hours, if not for one crucial moment. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian, tried to hand over her purse but dropped it. The contents scattered across the floor, coins rolling, papers fluttering, the sound sharp in the tense silence. Max spun toward the noise, his finger tightening on the trigger. But his movement was too quick, too erratic. The gun swung past Mrs. Henderson and aimed directly at Officer Marlowe, who was reaching for his radio to call for backup. Time fractures when love meets danger. In that split second, Caleb didn't see an officer who'd wronged him. He saw a human being who needed saving. The physics of the moment played out in slow motion. Mac's trigger finger contracted. The firing pin struck the cartridge. The bullet began its deadly journey across the room. But Caleb was already moving. His body launched forward with the desperation of a father protecting his child, except he was protecting someone else's child, someone else's family. The gunman's surprise at the sudden movement caused his aim to shift slightly, but not enough to miss entirely. The crack of gunfire shattered the air like breaking glass. Screams erupted from every corner of the room. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of fear-induced sweat. Children cried. Adults shouted. Chaos consumed the space. Caleb's shoulder absorbed the bullet's impact with a sound like a hammer hitting meat. The force spun him sideways, his work boots losing their grip on the polished floor. He crashed into a table of refreshments, sending coffee and pastries flying as he crumpled to the ground. From behind an overturned chair, Liana watched her father fall. Her 8-year-old mind couldn't process the full scope of what had happened, but she understood the essential truth. Her daddy had thrown himself in front of danger to protect someone else. The man who read her bedtime stories and fixed her broken toys had just proven that heroes really do exist. "Daddy!" she screamed, the sound cutting through the chaos like a blade. Officer Marlowe stood frozen, his weapon half-drawn, staring at the man bleeding on the floor. The bullet that should have ended his life had instead torn through Caleb Wainwright's shoulder. The same man he'd humiliated 3 years ago had just saved his life. The weight of that realization hit him like a physical blow. This quiet, single father, this man he'd dismissed and degraded, had risked everything to protect him. The badge on Marlowe's chest suddenly felt heavier than lead. Other officers arrived within minutes, securing the scene and apprehending Mac Dunbar. But Victor Marlowe barely noticed. He knelt beside Caleb, pressing his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding while paramedics rushed in. "Why?" Marlowe whispered, his voice breaking. "Why did you do it?" Caleb's eyes found his, clear despite the pain. "Because it was right," he said simply. If this story is touching your heart, hit that subscribe button. We need more stories like this in the world. As paramedics worked to stabilize Caleb Wainwright, Officer Victor Marlowe stood frozen in the aftermath of gunfire. The community center had transformed into a medical emergency scene. But Victor couldn't move. His training told him to secure the area, file reports, and coordinate with arriving backup. Instead, he stared at the man who'd just taken a bullet meant for him. The memories hit him like a flood breaking through a dam. 3 years ago, the Harvest Festival, a little girl knocking over pumpkins, and this same man, this quiet, gentle man, absorbing Victor's harsh words with dignity, while his daughter cried against his leg. The shame of that moment had been buried beneath years of justification, but now it roared back with crushing clarity. "I was wrong," Victor whispered, his voice lost in the chaos around him. "I was so wrong." The festival scene played in his mind with vivid detail. How Caleb had immediately knelt to comfort his daughter. How he'd offered to clean up the mess without complaint. How he'd never once raised his voice or challenged Victor's authority, even when that authority was being misused. Victor remembered the crowd's uncomfortable silence as he dressed down this hard-working father. He remembered the way other parents had looked away, embarrassed by the display of unnecessary power. Most painfully, he remembered the tears in Liana's eyes as she watched her father being humiliated. He tried to apologize, Victor said to no one in particular, his voice growing stronger but shaking with emotion. He was trying to apologize, and I just kept going. The weight of realization was crushing. This man he'd dismissed as irresponsible, this father he'd publicly shamed, had just risked his life to save him. Not because Victor deserved it, not because the badge demanded it, but because Caleb Wainwright was the kind of person who would sacrifice himself for others, even those who'd wronged him. "Officer Marlowe?" A paramedic called out. "We need to get him to the hospital now." Victor watched as they loaded Caleb onto the stretcher. Even in pain, even bleeding from a gunshot wound, Caleb's eyes searched the room for his daughter. When he spotted Liana being comforted by Mrs. Henderson, he tried to smile, tried to reassure her, even as his strength faded. That's when it happened. The man who'd stood tall in authority for 22 years, who'd built his identity around being in control, suddenly found his knees buckling. The weight of shame, gratitude, and recognition crashed over him like a wave. His carefully constructed walls crumbled in an instant. Victor Marlowe collapsed to the cold tile floor. The sound of his fall silenced the remaining chaos. Everyone in the community center turned to see this uniformed officer, this symbol of strength and authority, sobbing on the ground. His shoulders shook with the force of emotions he'd suppressed for years. Tears streamed down his weathered face, each drop carrying the weight of his regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The community watched in stunned silence as their authority figure became completely human before their eyes. Mrs. Henderson, still holding Liana, stared with wide eyes. The teenagers who'd been volunteering stood frozen. Even the other officers arriving on scene stopped to process what they were seeing. This wasn't weakness. This was truth. Victor's collapse wasn't just physical. It was the complete surrender of the prideful man he'd become. Every harsh word, every moment of unnecessary authority, every time he'd chosen power over compassion came flooding back. The badge on his chest, once a symbol of his strength, now felt like a weight he was unworthy to carry. "He saved my life," Victor said through his tears, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "That man I treated so badly, he saved my life." The contrast was striking. Minutes earlier, Victor had been the one in charge, the professional handling the crisis. Now he was the one being helped to his feet by fellow officers, his vulnerability exposed to the very community he'd sworn to protect. But in that moment of complete breakdown, something beautiful happened. The people watching didn't see weakness. They saw honesty. They saw a man finally confronting the truth about himself, finally allowing grace to break through the armor of pride. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is fall apart. In that moment, Officer Marlowe didn't just collapse, he surrendered to the truth. The healing for both men could finally begin. 2 days after the shooting, Officer Victor Marlowe stood outside room 314 at Fairview General Hospital, his hand trembling as he reached for the door handle. Inside, Caleb Wainwright was recovering from surgery to remove bullet fragments from his shoulder. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and hope, but Victor's heart pounded with fear. Not of physical danger, but of facing the man whose grace had shattered his pride. Liana sat beside her father's bed, coloring in a book while Caleb dozed. The sight of them together, this gentle father and his devoted daughter, made Victor's chest tight with emotion. He knocked softly. "Come in," Caleb said, his voice weak but steady. When Victor entered, still in civilian clothes, Caleb's eyes showed no anger, no resentment, just quiet recognition. "Officer Marlowe," Caleb said simply. "Just Victor," he replied, pulling up a chair. "I'm not here as a cop, I'm here as a man who needs to apologize." Liana looked up from her coloring, studying this uniformed figure who'd caused her father pain years ago. But children often see truth more clearly than adults. She saw the tears in Victor's eyes, the genuine remorse in his posture. 3 years ago at the festival, Victor began, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I did to you, how I treated you, it was wrong. Completely wrong. You were just being a good father, and I turned it into something ugly because I was more concerned with showing authority than showing humanity." Caleb listened, without interruption, his expression calm. "I've carried that shame for 3 years, Victor continued, but I was too proud to admit it, too proud to face what I'd become. And you," his voice broke, "you took a bullet meant for me. After everything I put you through, you saved my life." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of years and the possibility of healing. "I forgive you," Caleb said finally. "I forgave you a long time ago, Victor. Holding on to anger would have hurt me more than it hurt you." Victor's shoulders shook with relief and continued remorse. "How do you do it? How do you forgive someone who doesn't deserve it?" "Because everybody deserves a second chance," Caleb replied, "even officers who make mistakes." The conversation lasted an hour, 2 men finally seeing each other clearly. When Victor left, he'd been fundamentally changed, not just humbled, but transformed by the encounter with genuine forgiveness. Word of the shooting spread quickly through Fairview, but it was the story behind the story that captured hearts. The quiet single father who'd taken a bullet for the officer who'd wronged him. The hardened cop who'd collapsed in recognition of his own failures. The power of redemption played out in real time. Community vigils were held, not just for Caleb's recovery, but for the healing of old wounds. Neighbors who'd witnessed the festival incident 3 years earlier came forward to share their discomfort with what they'd seen. Conversations about respect, accountability, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity filled coffee shops and dinner tables. The Fairview City Council established the Caleb Wainwright Community Hero Award, recognizing citizens whose quiet service often goes unnoticed. The first recipient was Maria Santos, a single mother who'd been tutoring neighborhood children for free. The second was elderly Mr. Chen, who'd been delivering groceries to homebound seniors without fanfare. Victor Marlowe requested reassignment to community policing, specifically asking to work with youth programs. He began mentoring young officers, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and the importance of treating every citizen with respect. His vulnerability became his strength, his breakdown became his breakthrough. Caleb returned to work 6 weeks later, his arm in a sling but his spirit undimmed. At Morrison's Hardware, customers who'd barely acknowledged him before now greeted him by name. But nothing had changed in Caleb's approach. He remained the same steady, reliable man he'd always been. His heroism hadn't made him proud. It had simply revealed the character that was always there. The bond between father and daughter deepened through the recovery process. Liana had seen her father's courage firsthand, and Caleb had been reminded of why living with integrity mattered so much. They were stronger together. True heroism isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing love over pride, forgiveness over bitterness, and hope over fear. What's your takeaway from Caleb and Officer Marlowe's story? Share it below. Your words might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. 5 years have passed since that autumn day in Fairview, and the ripples of Caleb Wainwright's sacrifice continue to transform lives. Caleb still works at Morrison's Hardware, still picks up Liana from school, still reads bedtime stories with the same gentle patience. But now, customers linger to chat, neighbors wave from across the street, and the community sees him for who he's always been. A quiet hero whose strength was never in question, only overlooked. Liana, now 13, carries herself with the confidence of someone who's witnessed real courage. She volunteers at the community center where her father nearly died, helping younger children with homework. When classmates ask about her father's heroism, she simply says, "He's always been my hero." Other people just finally noticed. Officer Victor Marlowe, now Sergeant Marlowe, has become the department's leading voice on community engagement. His training sessions for new recruits include one non-negotiable topic: the day a single father's forgiveness changed his life. He speaks at schools, community events, and police academies across the state, sharing how pride nearly cost him everything and how grace saved him. The community center where the shooting occurred now displays a simple plaque, dedicated to everyday heroes who choose courage over comfort. No names, no grand statements, just a reminder that heroism lives in ordinary moments and ordinary people. But the real transformation isn't in plaques or ceremonies. It's in the way people treat each other. Store clerks who remember customers' names, teachers who see potential in struggling students, police officers who choose patience over power. The shooting lasted seconds, but its impact continues to reshape hearts. This story reminds us that we all carry the capacity for both pride and grace. We've all been Victor Marlowe, quick to judge, slow to apologize, protected by our positions and assumptions. We've all been Caleb Wainwright, overlooked, underestimated, carrying strength that others can't see. The beautiful truth is that redemption doesn't require perfection. It requires honesty. The willingness to admit when we're wrong, the courage to forgive when we're hurt, the choice to see humanity in everyone we meet. Fairview learned that heroes aren't born from titles or training. They're revealed in moments when love overcomes fear, when sacrifice conquers selfishness, when grace defeats pride. Marcus Dunbar, the gunman who started it all, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. But even he received letters from Caleb during his recovery. Not condemnation, but encouragement to find a better path. That's the kind of man who takes a bullet for his enemy. In Fairview, they still talk about that autumn day when a single father taught an entire community what true strength looks like. Not in the badge, not in the uniform, but in the willingness to lay down your life for someone who wronged you. Before you go, if stories like this inspire you to see the hero in everyday people, make sure you're subscribed to Hearts Unbroken. Ring that notification bell, because everyone deserves to know that their story matters.